Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience for this, the fourth and final webinar in the series on exploring the 10 Years Beyond Bushfires report. The focus today, or the topic, is supporting recovery for children, families and schools. My name's Andrew Coughlin. I'm head of the Emergency Services Program with Australian Red Cross, and I'm delighted to be your host and particularly interested in today's topic. I think one that is near and dear to many of us, that being the recovery of kids, families and schools, the impact disasters have on schools and the way we deal with them. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm actually hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be participating in this event, and I'm sure there's quite a few. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to both the lands and waters across Australia. A little bit of housekeeping first, if I may. Today's event will be recorded and made available afterwards. So if you miss anything or there's particularly significant stuff that you want to go back and rehear or share with friends or what have you, that option will be there. Today we'll be using the question and answer feature on Zoom to take questions. So please make note of that and post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat window. You'll be able to upvote questions or click on questions that you wanted to hear asked, and the more within that, the more people respond to a particular question or thumbs up a question, we will try and get those ones to the top. I'll do my best to ask a number of these to our speakers throughout the presentation. I'd encourage you to use the chat window as well to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations. And just a reminder that in doing that, you'll need to select the icon All Panellists and Attendees in the drop-down menu so that everyone attending today gets to see your messages if that's what you intend. I'd also like to remind you or ask that you please be respectful of each other, and particularly our presenters, when posting any comments or questions, and I'm sure that won't be an issue. The topic of today's webinar, by its very nature, might be a little bit sensitive for some people, and there's some fairly emotive pictures and stories that we're going to share and hear about, and I think they'll really bring the topic to life. But that said, there'll be some services available to access if you should need them, and there's a couple of links there, to one to Lifeline and the other to Beyond Blue, so please feel free to avail yourselves of those if that's useful. Moving on to our speakers today, and we're planning to run today's webinar a little bit differently to some of the previous ones, in that it will be more of a conversational style. So we get the perspectives of Lisa, Bron and Jane on a number of different questions. We'll hear from them first with a little bit of a story or vignette of some of their experience and their knowledge, but then we'll get into more of a conversational style setting. And so from that point of view, I'd love to incorporate your questions as part of that conversation. So again, please use the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Don't just save your questions towards the end, and I'll aim to weave those questions in as we go with the conversation. So can I ask you to join me, please, in welcoming our speakers for today. Lisa Gibbs is the Director of Child and Community Wellbeing at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. She's also the lead of Community Resilience in the Centre for Disaster Management and Public Safety. Lisa leads public health research in disaster recovery and resilience, and also child health and wellbeing. She has extensive experience leading mixed method, multidisciplinary studies with cross-sectoral partners and high impact outcomes. And some of the work that's been done through that program over the last decade has really been quite phenomenal in really pushing the agenda and developing the insights that we have into disasters and their impacts in the recovery process. Lisa's also published over 130 academic peer-reviewed papers, as well as translating those findings into practical guides for partner agencies and wider audiences. And again, in the recovery context, I think one of the great successes of the Beyond Bushfires work has been the way in which Lisa and others have been able to translate that into practical information and knowledge that we can use in the field. The research findings in terms of disaster recovery have been highly influential in guiding both policy and practice across Australia as well, and also internationally. So a big welcome to you, Lisa. Jane Nursey is the second of our guests today, and Jane is the Director of Clinical Services at Phoenix Australia, which is the Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health. And Jane is also a registered clinical neuropsychologist with 30 years experience in the field of post-traumatic mental health. So a diversity of experience there. Following the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria in 2009, Jane oversaw the development and implementation of a statewide clinical service for bushfire-affected communities run out of the Austin Hospital in Melbourne. Jane's key areas of expertise lie in the development, implementation and evaluation of hospital, school and community-based mental health and trauma recovery programs, providing policy and service development advice to high-risk government and industry organisations, and also developing and implementing specialist evidence-based training programs. Jane's involved in research tracking long-term outcomes of children living in bushfire-impacted communities, obviously very topical today, and investigating innovative treatments for PTSD. And last but by no means least, I'd like to welcome Bron Sparks. Bron survived the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires with her husband and two young children who were 2 and 4 years old at the time, and they were living in Kinglake. They narrowly escaped their burning home and sheltered together between water tanks under a woolen blanket. They returned to Kinglake and lived in a caravan on their block for about 2.5 years while they rebuilt not only their home, but also their lives with the support of friends, family and community. In 2014, the family moved to Canberra, and Bron now works for the National Recovery and Resilience Agency as the Director for National Disaster Recovery Policy and Frameworks. So really drawing on those personal experiences and bringing the lessons and the opportunities to make things better for people into the future to the fore in that role. Bron's also completing a Master's in Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Development at the University of Newcastle. So there are 3 guests this afternoon, and as I said at the outset, I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of them their different perspectives on this really significant topic of children, families and recovery from disaster. So enough from me. I'd like to throw to Bron first. And Bron, obviously from the introduction, both you and your family have very close personal experience of the Black Saturday bushfires back in 2009, and obviously the long-term recovery impacts and ramifications for a long period after that. I'm just wondering if you could share with us what happened, what happens, and how to manage in the years after the disaster. So welcome, Bron.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much to everyone on the line. I'm going to be sharing my story with you from Ngunnawal country, and would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'll start my story with a small series of photos that I would like to share with you. So Charlotte, if you could pop up the first picture. So this photo is taken before the fires. Dom and Lola, they were 2 and 4 at the time. We were living our best life in the mountains and things were simple, innocent, and the children were curious. Next photo, please. A familiar photo for many. This was after the worst of the fire front had passed and we had escaped our burning house. Next photo, please. This photo always gets me and I've never shared it before. It was taken late that night. We were at a friend's house, which was familiar and safe. But for Dom, everything had changed. Next photo, please. This is about 9 to 12 months afterwards and was our home for 2 years while we rebuilt. Life was messy and chaotic, but we made the best of it. And the final photo, thanks, Charlotte. This is our most recent family photo taken 12 years after the fires on the 7th of February 2021. I take one every year on this day to mark another significant milestone in our recovery journey and to show how far we have come. And with that, I hope that this small collection of photos that I've shared with you today can represent hope. But I guess I'll tell you a little bit about, our journey over the last 12 years. So on the 7th of February 2009, our family experienced the unimaginable. We never intended to be there, but by unfortunate circumstance, we were. With our world turned on its head and with nothing familiar or safe, and children who are utterly dependent on you as a parent, what do you do? How do you recover from something like that? There's no frame of reference to guide you. How do you parent when you have no home, you're all traumatized, and you're having to start navigating a really complex recovery? You're disoriented and every moment is dependent on a decision that you make. What is for dinner? What grants are available? What do I do with these donations that are turning up on my doorstep? Counselling, recovery centres, temporary accommodation. Do we go back? Do we rebuild? How do we rebuild? My child doesn't have socks. And how do I take my next breath? It was chaos. Something as simple as donated clothing and linens, washed in different washing powders and smelling of other people's homes. Those unfamiliar smells exacerbated the disorientation and the chaos for us. So what helped us in those early days? Bringing back the familiar. Routine created safety, and routine was something that we could control. Meal times, what were the children's favourite meals? Bedtime and bath time routines, stories with the children and playgroup. Limit how much time your children are in recovery centres. Being present and in the moment helped you notice and meet those immediate needs of both yourself and your children. But this is actually really tough. You were so busy surviving that you forgot to stop and just be present for you, for your children, for your partner and your family. To do this, you have to consciously force yourself to slow down and focus on what is important for each member in the family right now and in that moment. Routine helped here. When I couldn't be fully present for my children and my family, I leaned on routine. Going through routine motions helped both the children feel safe and me feel safe. I also felt I was actually able to do something that would meet their needs without triggering my own trauma. Delegate. Recovery is a long game. Use the resources that are available to you. Create a village of trusted people to support you and your family and your children. Ask for help and accept help that meets your needs when it's offered. For us, case managers were a godsend. Also, give yourself permission to turn down help if the help that's offered will not actually meet your needs. It's okay to do that. Be patient. We waited for the children to give us the green light on big steps forward. We waited for each child to tell us when they were ready to return to the block. For Dom, it was about 2 weeks after the fires, and for Lola, it was about 5. It wasn't for at least 5 months until we stayed the night in the caravan for the first time, even though the caravan had been there for many months prior. And when we did, it was actually like coming home. So even in this chaos, returning home and staying in the caravan, our sense of place was restored.
Thanks, Bron. Some really interesting insights there into that immediate aftermath of what had gone on. I wonder if you could share with us the next couple of years, where you went from there.
Yeah, sure. So the next 2 to 3 years, I sort of look back at those and say these were the lost years where chaos and trauma really reigned. Family life, growing, learning was disrupted by the physical and the emotional recovery process. We were rebuilding, we were living in a caravan on a burnt out block. We didn't have running hot water in the caravan. I was trying to work shift work, and we were all trying to just survive day to day. I remember making a comment that I take my children to psychologists instead of ballet or to the park during this time. But don't worry, ballet did come later. Our family dynamic was disrupted and changed because of our experience on the day when it was just the four of us together alone. And when it was just the four of us together alone afterwards, we would sort of ping off each other. We were easily triggered by, I guess, the four of us being together alone. Things as simple as having a trusted friend or a family member join us for dinner, so someone from our village that we had created, helped to shift some of this pressure on our family dynamic. And we still use this tactic even today. In those 2 to 3 years, trauma was at the worst during this time. And so I encourage people, seek help. I knew that I was in trouble and I sought professional therapeutic help at around that sort of 8-month time frame. And I maintained that for about 4 years and it helped. But in doing this, be discerning in who you seek help from. If a therapist isn't right for you, that's okay. It's okay to say no, thank you, and seek out other therapists. You have to find what works for you and for your children and for your family. Parenting was really tough, especially when you're dealing with your own trauma. Maintaining parenting boundaries for the children was really difficult. And we often had to just let things go or pick our battles to maintain the peace. This wasn't ideal, but we did what we could to survive. Remember before I said that this was a long game? Amidst the chaos, prioritise your own self-care. It's really tough to do this and you feel selfish doing it. And I hated it when anyone told me to do this for myself. But it's critical and it will sustain you. When things feel like they're out of control, try and slow things down. Go at your own pace, do things in your own time, and make those big decisions when you are ready. This is your children's, your partners, your families, and your recovery. It's no one else's. During these years, our children also started school. School was critical to their recovery. We were so fortunate to be part of a school community that was ultra sensitive to their trauma, their experience, and their recovery needs, and they protected them from further harm. There was structure, certainty, and never any surprises for the children when they went to school. The teachers would always notice where their students were at any given time and would hold a safe space for them when they had moments of distress or when the children just needed to talk. I brought in other therapeutic programs that had movement, creative art, and inquiry, which really supported and empowered the children in their own recovery. And that school community really became an important part of our village. During the chaos, there were still moments of joy. And looking back, it's really easy to overlook these moments or forget them. I encourage you to take photos to remind yourself in the future that there were good times. This is important and it'll be especially important for your children later on. While it doesn't feel like it at the time during this sort of period, things do get better.
Thanks, Bron. Again, some fantastic insights and really compelling story about your experience. We really appreciate you sharing it. I wonder how things have been over the longer term. How have things been from that sort of 2 or 3 year mark through until today? What is it now? 12 years on, 12 and a bit years, nearly 13.
Yeah, sure. So after about 4 years, we did move into a house that we rebuilt, our home, and it's still my forever home. But after 4 years, we decided to move interstate. I had an opportunity with work to come to Canberra. And we really thought that if we wanted to see if a change of environment would really help us and our family to heal. It's hard to really know if that did help. Like with all decisions, there's pros and cons. But I certainly look at where we are at now and can see how far we have come since the 7th of February 2009. My biggest regret was probably moving the children away from a school who really understood and could support who and why my children are the way they are. Learning was really hard for them. It often felt like they would take one step forward and then take 2 steps back a lot of the time, particularly in those sort of foundational years. And to give an example of that, because so much of my son's foundational literacy learning was disrupted in his early primary years, by the time he was in grade 6, writing and spelling for him was a significant challenge. And this caused a lot of behavioural difficulties for him in the classroom and frustration for his teachers, and he was in trouble all of the time, and it was really distressing for him. So we sort of took matters into our own hands and we invested in specialist literacy support for him. And with one-on-one support for about a term and a half, he actually caught up, and it gave him a significant boost in confidence, and he's now in year 9 and he's thriving. So that's just a bit of an example of, you know, where you can, I guess, take action and lean into your recovery and find different pathways. So while we still have moments of distress and tough times, they have become less frequent. And when they come, they're actually a lot easier to move through. So we'll continue to grow and heal as a family and as individuals. But really reflecting on the last 12 years, I'm really proud of us all as we have come so far. And I might leave it at there, but thank you for allowing me to share some of my experiences with you today. And for anyone who's watching, I hope that my story can give you hope that you can and you will recover. Thank you.
Thanks, Bron. We really appreciate you sharing your story with us. I think it's an extraordinary journey you've been on that I know a number of our people joining the webinar are probably in the midst of a similar journey, but very early in the piece, and no doubt you sharing your experience will be incredibly useful to them. So thank you so much. I'll come back to you a little later with potentially a question or two, but I'd like to move to a couple of different perspectives first, and then we'll come back to you, Bron. So thank you. I'd like to introduce Jane next. And Jane, you've supported many children, families and schools through disasters and also worked with trained mental health professionals. What are some of the important things to understand and perhaps some strategies or recommendations for people who are in a situation such as Bron found herself in all those years ago in supporting children and families? Any suggestions from your perspective and your work?
Jane, you're on mute.
I didn't miss that cue, sorry. So look, thank you. I think Bron's story really does embody many of the key messages and findings that research supports in terms of strategies that can help people move through that recovery journey. And I think her story also illustrates that there's no one way that people move through this. You know, everyone's going to react differently. And I think it's important to understand that disasters can impact the well-being of everyone, from infants and toddlers through to the very elderly. And we often think that infants and toddlers and young children either aren't going to remember the experience or will just move through it without many problems because they're not dealing with the broader aspects of it. But the reality is even pre-verbal children are going to have an emotional and an sensory experience that can stay with them for a very long time and that might impact them going forward. So I think it's important for people to understand that and to be aware of it, and for parents to be on the lookout for things that might key them into those impacts. I think everyone also will have a different experience and recovery journey, and even those family members that live through the experience together, as Bron's family did, you know, all in the one place and experiencing that terrifying experience together. Each of them reacted differently, and each of them have needed to do different things across the recovery journey in order to ensure their own recovery. And they've navigated that incredibly well from intuition and the support of each other and the support of other people around them. I think it's important to say up front that we know that the majority of people are going to be pretty resilient, that while many people, and perhaps the majority of people in a disaster, will experience some emotional distress and impact on well-being that might curtail their activities for a while, might interrupt their normal routine, decrease their coping ability perhaps for a while, and certainly distract them. For the majority of people, they'll get back on track, really relying on their own resources, but more importantly, using people around them to support them, and taking advantages of the help that's available. But probably the majority aren't going to need to seek support from a mental health professional in the long run. Perhaps you can put up the slide, Charlotte, just of the common trajectories after trauma. So this is just a slide that shows what we are patterns, I guess, of what we see. Obviously, this isn't real life, but really patterns that we often can see, and it's true across ages and population. So on the blue, on the yellow line there will be a certain percentage of people that really move through the experience without it necessarily changing much for them and impacting them too much. The more common experience of people that we see is that there is an initial impact and the immediate aftermath that might continue for a few weeks or even a few months, but they recover, get back to their pre-trauma experience of functioning, if you like. There's a group that cope well for a long period of time, who might move straight into survivor mode and keep focused on the recovery for a long period of time. But down the track, perhaps when things slow down and the immediate needs are being met, really decompensate a little and perhaps begin to experience some of that distress in a delayed fashion. And then there are others who really, perhaps because of pre-existing issues in their life or difficulties, perhaps have real difficulty recovering. Can you put up the slide on recovery journey, please? Just a slide that illustrates what we often do see in the aftermath and the different levels that that can be available. So we know that there's lots of chaos in those first few weeks and months. People are hyperactive, they're experiencing intense emotions, there's a focus on keeping safe. And into the next 6 months, there's a lot of uncertainty about, what rebuilding is going to look like, what recovery is going to look like, and there's still that level of hypervigilance. As time moves on, and as Bron described, that rebuilding period can be quite traumatic in itself. And the anniversaries come up and those sorts of things. But there is a sense that things are moving on, that they're on track. And then once you sort of get to 2 years, 12 months might be a bit too soon for some people, but certainly 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the track, there's a sense that you've moved through this. There's still going to be impacts, but that recovery journey has been navigated successfully, potentially, for the majority of people. So I think that people will pass through different phases of those, and some will experience them at different times. And it's important that families are perhaps really aware that not every family member is going to pass through that journey at the same time in the same way. And so therefore, being tolerant, I guess, of those different experiences and the way their grief and their distress gets expressed over a prolonged period is going to be really important. Children can show those signs of distress off and on for a number of years, and those impacts, despite their resilience, can be seen in different ways in their learning outcomes, in their changes in their behaviour, in the way they interact and relate with others. So I think important just to be tuned into that and not dismiss it, even if it's years down the track that some of those issues are being brought up, that not forgetting that the early trauma experience might be having an impact even now. I think for children and infants, young children and infants, it's really important to very quickly get in and reassure them early. You know, they are going to be hypervigilant. They are going to react to sudden changes in their environment, to loud noises, to smells, to strong emotions in others, and therefore appear to be quite irritable and distressed and unsettled, and perhaps act that out in a number of ways, or regress in some of their milestones. And I think, you know, it's being aware again what the likely cause of that. You know, they are going to be picking up on how the parents are feeling and coping. And from a parent point of view, the idea of trying to re-establish some sort of routine as early as possible is a safety net. Being able to reassure young children and keep them safe as quickly and as early as possible. And even reassuring them, if you're living in very different circumstances, that from your point of view aren't feeling comfortable, but trying to find the sort of novelty in that and reassuring children that things are back in normal, getting back to normal. So the idea that you're having the meal times at the normal times that you would, that they're going to school, that there's play dates with kids, that there's activities that they can continue to do that provide a level of structure in their day and routine in their day is really important. I think the most important thing to take away and the most important strategy is really that social support is fundamental to recovery, and that if you don't have that and if you don't seek that out, then it's not necessarily going to be a smooth journey as it could be. You know, we are social beings. It is really important to find someone, even if you're a totally independent person who likes to rely on yourself, the idea of having someone that you can call on to help when things are difficult, who can provide meals if you can't do that, who you can chat to and just have someone listen to you, is incredibly important to recovery. I'm aware that I'm probably out of time. I did just want to put up a final slide around the levels of care that we see, stepped model of recovery. So just to understand that, taking into account that the majority of people are going to be resilient and will get by pretty well, but that social support early on is going to be helpful and all the way throughout the journey. So the step care model is what the research tells us is the best approach to supporting people's mental health recovery and psychosocial recovery following disaster. And so something like psychological first aid and advice and support in those first few days, making sure that people's immediate needs are getting met, helping them to calm down, helping them to feel safe, are really very important in those first few days to bring the adrenaline levels down in people and just calm down that stress response. For people who continue to have some ongoing distress and coping difficulties, then teaching skills around coping and managing are really important. So that's the sort of simple psychological and social strategies. So learning things like emotional regulation techniques and problem solving around particular issues, how to build a social support network. Those are skills that can be really instructive and helpful in getting through. And then at the top of the levels there is seeking mental health treatment for those people that go on to develop a mental health disorder. And I can talk more about that later if we need to. Thanks, Andrew.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jane. Some really valuable insights, I think, particularly for people who are, you know, at different stages along that recovery journey. was particularly taken with your observations around the importance of social support. Anyone who's lived through, the Melbourne experience of COVID and various other people in lockdown, etc., that value of emotional support from your neighbours and your friends and those simple things have really come to the fore over the last couple of years, I think, across the country, but probably across the globe. So really highlight for us. Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to pass now to Lisa. And just as I do that, a reminder to people, if you have any questions from the presentations that you're hearing, please do put them in the Q&A box and we'll endeavour to get to some of those after we hear from Lisa and get some input from each of our presenters on some of those. Lisa, what does your research and the broader evidence around tell us about disaster impacts and some of the support options for children, families and schools?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, I guess, first of all, it totally supports the issues and perspective that both Bron and Jane have spoken about already. And I certainly support Jane's reminder that there's a spectrum of impacts and that some people will have reasonably mild experiences and others more severe. But I think what is probably most shocking about Bron's story, it was so compelling about the impact on them as individuals and as a family. And what is most shocking to me is that's not an isolated story. That we don't look at that and go, oh my goodness, that is really rare, terrible, but thank goodness that doesn't happen to other people, because actually it's a common story. And there are many people who do have those really profound impacts on them from that initial experience and from the years afterwards. And our research really shows that that the disruption at community level afterwards and at school level and in the home is part of the ongoing damage from what has taken place. And managing that is as much of a struggle as managing the aftermath of the terror of the disaster experience itself. Certainly our research shows the impact on parenting, the whole parenting experience, your capacity to be patient and to be considered in how you deal with your children, the fact that their behaviours have changed because of their trauma experiences, and how do you adapt to that? And are you able to parent in a way that you value? These are really important to the self in that experience and have potentially lifelong impacts. The child experience and the teenager experience of loss of a sense of safety and stability really came through in our research. And it was interesting that so many of the stories we heard from children, from parents, from grandparents was often accompanied with the comment, we're not really sure if this is from the bushfires or not. But we heard it repeated, the anxiety around change, the unable to deal with added expectations. And really what I found encouraging in those stories was like Bron's story, that as a family they decided how to deal with that and where they would live or where the kids would go to school or what sports club they'd engage with or whatever. It was a shared decision-making process. And certainly in the school, we see disruptions for years afterwards. That's just, it's such an added pressure for the teachers and the students, and the real shift from a primary focus on learning to a primary focus on, for God's sake, let's just maintain well-being. And if we get that right, maybe we can get back to the learning. And a paper has just been published, an international meta-analysis of 81 studies with over, I think it's 50,000 participants, that confirms what we already know, that well-being and academic achievements are connected, that if your well-being is undermined, your learning is likely to be undermined. And that's certainly reinforced by our own research, where we tracked kids affected by the Black Saturday bushfires for 8 years afterwards and found there was still evidence of academic impacts at 8 years. And that's not all of the students, but a clear pattern, and particularly from those communities that had been highly affected by the bushfires. So that's, you know, it's a real concern and something that we have to be really focused on now, where we've got so many families affected by both bushfires and COVID and many other disaster events. But I'm also really encouraged by the fact that we've learnt so much over the last decade. We now have evidence emerging internationally that the psychosocial support programs that Jane was talking about, that are available for all students and at those next levels of need as well, there's clear evidence that they make a difference, that they do result in improvements that are greater than what might just occur if the kids are left to recover on their own. So that's a really important message, and many of those programs are available here in Australia. We know the Department of Education is aware of the need for learning supports, and they're putting those in place, and they're aware of the need for mental health supports, and they're putting those in place in school settings. What we want to keep advocating for is just a reminder to create space for recovery, and not to push to get back on track with academic targets, and in the process actually add pressure and more demands. So achieve more by doing less would be the message we would put out. And Andrew, the final thing I just want to raise is that let's not lose sight of children's capacity and the amazing contributions they can make in their own creativity. I've just got one slide to share. Charlotte, if you could show the colourful slide. These are actually family friends of ours, two teenage boys who were performers at festivals, and they had to evacuate to the Bega Showgrounds with their mum. Their house was under threat. They packed all their valuables in the car, including their performing gear. And, you know, when you're waiting for days, wondering whether fires are going to approach, it gets tedious as well as stressful. So they pulled out their performing gear and entertained all the people at the evacuation centre, and ran workshops for the kids in circus arts, which was just such a fabulous contribution at such a critical time. And I find this inspiration when we're looking at these issues to just say, you know what, it's tough, and aren't people amazing with what they can pull out in these times?
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. A lovely note to end your little segment on. Kids and creativity. So you're spot on. We sometimes look for the challenges and the needs, but it's often the resilience and the ability kids show to be able to get on with things and find different ways to deal with things. Thank you to the three of you for those little vignettes. I'd like to now go to a few questions and invite all of you to contribute if you see fit. So the first one I wanted to ask, and I might start with you, Bron, if that's okay, is you talked a little bit about case managers and the value of them, and you talked a bit about accepting help and sometimes not accepting help for various different reasons when it was important or not to the family. One of the things I've certainly found in experience dealing with things like appeal funds is for 6 or 12 months after a disaster happens, a lot of people will say, I'm okay, the person down the road's got some problems, why don't you go and help them? Or they need some assistance, or so on. What's your reflection of your ability to accept help and engage with organisations like charities and the like, who might not typically have been in your day-to-day existence until the bushfires happened? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, and great question. So you're right. We were a family that never sort of engaged in that space, and we were very self-sufficient and so forth. But I think afterwards, it became apparent really early on that this is not something that we could do alone. And I think in the beginning there was sort of a bit of a fear of missing out, and if you didn't kind of gather up all of the different supports that were made available really early on, then they might not be there in 6 months' time, 12 months' time. And so there's this real sort of rush to try and make sure that, you know, you were catering to what your family needed, and sort of getting on top of grants and stuff like that. And that was really tough. And so I guess, you know, in hindsight, and what I said earlier is that, you know, take time to make those decisions, slow those sort of things down, because they will be available to you later on. And that assistance, you know, people are very willing to sort of make that assistance available, particularly when you share your story with them. And it doesn't have to be a big, you know, in-depth story, but just say, this is what happened. This is where I've been. I haven't had the capacity to actually navigate this process yet. Can you help me? So that's probably my response to that one.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Lisa, perhaps one for you. We know from, you know, stories like Bron's and others that we hear in the work that we do, that events like this clearly impact families and individuals in a big way. They also have an impact on communities and the concept of collective community trauma. Have you got any thoughts on that and any effective interventions for dealing with that, particularly in the context of children and younger people?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. The research on psychosocial support programs after disaster, the programs are mostly situated in schools or as individual treatment. There were some community-based ones, and I've got to sort of dig around and find the link to put in the chat for that paper that we've just released on that. From our Beyond Bushfires research, we were able to show a really clear association between involvement in local community groups and better mental health outcomes. And so I would really encourage that engagement with groups. And that's what's been such an issue with COVID. You know, it's the people who are recovering from Black Summer were really denied that it's such a critical element of the recovery experience. But connecting with others through those groups seems to be just really important. And it's not always positive, to be honest, because people recover in different ways and disagree, but they do provide a sense of belonging, shared information, looking out for each other. And that's a feature for both adults and children. So, but not, we're trying to build that evidence. It's still limited.
Okay, thank you. Jane, one for you, if I could. Someone's inquiring whether best practices for in-class trauma support to be delivered by classroom teachers, who obviously the kids know, or external organisations. Any thinking on that one?
Really good question. I would argue that there's potentially scope for both, but I certainly think that the in-class teacher delivery of a space, making a space in the classroom for kids to share their feelings and to talk about what's happening for them and to teach some skills in terms of emotional regulation skills and coping skills is absolutely important. And I think that that's what the research shows, really, that and implementing some of those psychosocial programs in the classroom by teachers can be very effective. The reality is the teacher provides a safe space for that to happen. The kids know them, and it's a sense of familiarity and provides structure around that. I think it's important, though, for teachers not to feel like they have to take on the role of being a counsellor or extend beyond their skill set of moving into providing therapy. That's not what it's about. It is more about just providing that psychosocial support at that very primary level. And for kids that they've got concerns about, to be referring those on to the school counsellors or asking the parents to perhaps take them to the GP and look at getting some external help. Having said that, I think there's also room for certainly for perhaps groups of children that might be struggling, running some school-based, more therapeutic programs, intervention programs, has also shown to be quite helpful. So for kids who might be showing some PTSD or mood symptoms, mostly we know that individual therapy is best for that, but there are some school-based programs that can be reasonably helpful. And again, around that skills teaching done by a mental health trained person can be quite effective.
Thanks, Jane. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about resilience building in communities, and schools are obviously a big part of communities. A lot of organisations work in schools in all sorts of programs. Are these some of the skills that you think could be taught and engaged with in schools before disasters happen as general resilience building that might in fact be helpful if and when they go through an experience like this?
Absolutely, totally. Something I've been really pushing for, I guess, and encourage as much as possible. The reality is I think the whole community, the whole population of Australia would benefit from some of that training, given that we are very prone to natural disasters in our community, and the pandemic in itself, you know, as something that impacts the whole population. I think those sorts of skills will never go astray. But I think in terms of school preparedness for managing disasters and even for managing the day-to-day trauma experience of individual students, I think that training is very important and invaluable, would be invaluable.
Okay, thank you. Bron, back to you if I could.
Can I just say that I do think that the Education Department in Victoria is doing a lot in that space at the moment. So
great.
That's good, yeah.
And I think certainly in Strathuyt and the school principal there did a fantastic job of leading that school and that community through the recovery experience over a number of years. I've heard her speak on a number of occasions, and it's always incredibly insightful. Bron, there's a couple of people who've asked about the sort of services that were available, and clearly there's a myriad of things, and you've touched on some of them that were available. I'm not going to ask you to comment on which were good, bad or otherwise, but I wonder, is there one standout thing that you found particularly helpful as a family in your recovery journey? Might it be, you know, the financial support, the mental health offerings, some of the community activities? Is there something that really sticks with you as, gee, I'm glad we did that and that was really helpful?
That's a really good question, and I guess my first response to that is that there's probably not one single thing that stood out from everything else. I think the collective and all of the wraparound supports that we drew on were the most helpful. So, you know, some of those supports were those really specific mental health, psychosocial supports, but then others were around, I remember making a comment a couple of months ago. We were also really fortunate to have building case managers, and in many ways having a building case manager to help sift through some of those really complex decisions. I was an owner builder, I'd never built a house before, was life-saving because it took so much pressure off. Other things that were really helpful was, you know, just prioritizing some of that self-care, engaging in, for me, it was physical exercise, you know, really intense exercise, and that really helped with recovery. Same with my son as well. So I think the thing that was most helpful was drawing on different types of supports, and collectively they really did contribute significantly to our recovery and continue to contribute to our recovery.
Great. Thanks, Bron. And I find the building case management a really interesting one, because I've always thought it's hard enough to renovate or build a house when you're doing it by choice and you're going into it eyes open. It's a very different circumstance you were in where it's thrust upon you.
Yeah, it was a crazy time.
No doubt, no doubt. And you've come out the other end smiling, which is great. Lisa, I wonder, from the research you've been involved with, have you got any reflections on some of the supports and the services that people have found particularly useful in their longer term recovery?
Yeah, we actually asked that question of people in our 10 Years Beyond Bushfires research, and we specifically said, you know, what has been most the most support for you and what's caused the most stress for you. And the top of the list for the source of most support was family. And so, you know, I think when we're thinking about policy and service delivery, it's not just direct support to those impacted, but also to those who are supporting those who are impacted, and what skills and resources might they need. Interestingly, the greatest source of stress was also family. So, and I think sometimes that's because, you know, like, let's face it, we do get on each other's nerves and drive each other insane, but also because people were really concerned for their family members, and that worry for others was a real source of stress. And so that's sort of the flip side, isn't it, to the value of family, is that you care so much about them that also they are a source of worry.
Yep. A good point to round things off on, Lisa. You can choose your friends, but your family are your family. So a really important one, particularly at times like those sort of experiences. Unfortunately, that's about all we've got time for. It's been, I think, you'll all agree, a really fascinating conversation and a really, really useful and at times inspiring conversation. So I'd like to again thank Lisa, Jane, and particularly Bron for taking the time to speak with us today, and in Bron's case, sharing a very personal story. It's one thing for each of us to get on here and talk about our professional experiences and insights. To share your own emotional journey and your family's journey, I think, is a really, really wonderful contribution to make to the discussion. So thanks, Bron, and thanks, Lisa and Jane. If you've enjoyed today's topic and you'd like to learn more about the education aspects of recovery and resilience, Ada will also be running the inaugural Dranzen, which is essentially the disaster teachers involved in disaster curriculum and the like, emergency management network. They'll be running their teachers forum on Wednesday, the 27th of October from 4 o'clock until 5:30 in the evening. And the link to register for that event will be in the chat. So you should be able to find that there if that's of interest to you. On behalf of Ada, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We'll send an email around once the recording from today's session is live on the Knowledge Hub, so you can go back and access different aspects of it, or indeed share it with people you think might benefit from it. When you exit today's Zoom session, you'll also be asked to complete a short survey. We'll use this information to ensure that our professional development events program continue to meet your needs. So please take the opportunity to do that. And certainly from my perspective, again, just to reinforce what a fantastic session it's been. We've really enjoyed the efforts and the input of each of our presenters. So thank you again to each of the three of them. It's been a pleasure to host this afternoon. And until next time, please stay safe. Those of you in Melbourne, look forward to a little bit more freedom in the next day or two. And farewell. We look forward to connecting again in the not too distant future. Thank you all.